Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ambassador, Director General Follen, I'm honored and happy to be here today, invited to beautiful Stockholm, and I would like to thank the organizers, the National Commission for UNESCO and also the National Museum of World Cultures for organizing this important event. What I would like to do today is follow up and sort of expound on what Maria has said and investigate the question how a country, a member state of the 1970 Convention can implement some of the regulations in the Convention and also follow up on the Security Council resolutions that were mentioned, 2199, and then of course 2253, which is also relevant in this context. And since it's been only a week ago, we should also mention 2347, which was passed only last Friday at the Security Council, which is probably the most far-reaching Security Council resolution when it comes to the protection of cultural heritage. So what I would like to share with you today is two areas of activity that Germany has been following over the past 4 or 5 years. And to be fair, I have to say that some of these activities started before UN Security Council Resolution 2199. It actually started in 2013 when Germany decided to reform, to redo its Cultural Heritage Protection Act. And I would also, in the third part, if I still have time, talk a little bit about what we've learned so far and what we think is necessary and should be done in the future. I'm speaking on behalf of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, which is the biggest cultural institution in Germany, one of the biggest in Europe, and of course on behalf of the Ancient Near East Museum at the Pergamon Museum that you can see here. The Ancient Near East Museum was established in 1899 as one of the big archaeological institutions in Germany at a time when Germany started to expand its view into the Near East after regained imperial power in the 1870s and 1880s. We're currently housed in the southern wing of the Pergamon Museum with a collection that comprises about 600,000 objects, 96% of which came to Berlin on the basis of partage agreements with the source countries, that is primarily Iraq and Syria. The rest of the objects, the remaining 4 or 5% of the objects, were acquired in the second half of the 19th century. The museum is not acquiring archaeological material anymore. Since I took office in 2014, we have not acquired anything at all, and I don't think we will do so in the future for obvious reasons. The curatorial concept is one of integrated object care and presentation, and this goes back to what Director General Follen said earlier. We too are an expert institution in the field of archaeological heritage of Iraq and Syria, and being one of the few expert institutions in this particular field also means that you take responsibility that goes beyond displaying objects, and this is why we're both active in serving as experts in the legal process of establishing a new law in Germany, and also why we're actually doing research together with national institutions such as the National Criminal Police and Customs. The objects that we are housing and displaying at the Ancient Near East Museum, some of them are famous and bigger, like the reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate of Babylon, and some are smaller, and when we look at these objects, it becomes clear why we are experts in the field of illicit trafficking, because this is pretty much the typology of what's in the market right now. So we actually have the knowledge to contribute to the fight against illicit trafficking on the basis of our own research. Let me start with the new German law that has been mentioned several times today. The new German law is a new German law because it's actually the reform of a law that was implemented in 2007. 2007 marks the implementation, unfortunately the first implementation of the UNESCO 1970 Convention in Germany. It took Germany a very long time to ratify in 1970, and this of course has to do with a strong art market, with a very outspoken art market and a very strong lobby for collectors. This hasn't changed. The lobbies are still very present and still very outspoken, but the general awareness of the problem has changed, and this is a sign for hope, I think, because it means that maybe 10 years down the road, we will have come to terms with this problem. So what Germany realized after 5 years of the 2007 Act was that it was not at all effective in implementing the 1970 Convention. Not a single restitution case was based on the German law alone, which meant that Germany had to do something about it because the 2007 law harmed Germany's international reputation because returns and restitutions were not possible on the basis of the law. Primarily, I will not go into legal details too much, but primarily because in order for a return to be effective, the country of origin would have to have listed the object in a national inventory. But how do you do that when objects are taken out of the ground illicitly, when archaeological sites are pillaged, and you as a country do not know about that? So there is no way you can actually make this work, and this is why Germany decided to redo its 2007 law. There was also the need to implement the EU Directive 2014/60, which Maria Mignana mentioned earlier. This is very interesting because it had due diligence rules that are now part of the German law and that apply to the acquisition of cultural property. Due diligence rules in this context are very important because if you want to have fair compensation as a buyer, you need to make clear that you've actually followed or applied due diligence. And the last goal, the driving force, the third driving point behind the new German law was an improved protection of cultural property in Germany from export, because Germany has always maintained that protecting cultural heritage has two sides to it. One is protecting your own cultural heritage by issuing export certificates, for example, and the other one is expecting other countries to do the same. So when you expect export certificates from Iraq and Syria or any other country, you should be able to do the same as a country that protects its own cultural property. It's actually part of the constitutional tasks of the German government to protect cultural property from going abroad uncontrolled, in an uncontrolled fashion. The new German law is very complicated. It has more than 90 paragraphs, and it would probably take all day to explain it to you, also because it's very complex and it tries to harmonize several different existing laws. There are 4 pillars that I would like to talk about very briefly, and the 4-pillar scheme I owe to Robert Peters, our colleague and friend, who's actually one of the authors of the new German law, a brilliant lawyer who works for the German government. Probably the most important pillar is the import provision pillar, which basically means that cultural property that has been illegally exported from a member state of the UNESCO 1970 Convention cannot be legally imported into Germany. This is a very simple equation. If something has been illegally exported, it cannot be legally imported into Germany. If it's legally exported, it can be legally imported, but not the other way around. This is very important because it means that if you want to import something into Germany, you need to have a valid export certificate, and you need to have a valid export certificate from the country of origin, not from a third country. If you want to import something from East Asia, an import certificate from Switzerland is not valid, obviously. This is very important because we were discussing this very extensively in the process. So again, legal import is only possible with an export certificate from the respective state. Second, return provisions, also a considerable improvement. The right to return for all cultural objects illegally exported from another state, all objects, not just those listed in a list, exists for countries that have ratified the 1970 convention, and the dates that are important here are the dates of the ratification of the UNESCO 1970 convention, which means when you're a country that has identified an object in the German art market, you want to have it back, then it's enough to prove that this object was illegally exported from your country and that you're actually the owner of this cultural property. You don't have to enter this object in a list anymore, which is extremely important for the effectiveness. Due diligence, this is probably the part of the law that caused the biggest problems with the art market and the collectors, because the big question was, how much due diligence can you oblige people to apply and to use? And following the EU directive that I've just mentioned, the new German law now provides that due diligence is not only necessary for the professional art market, but for anybody who wants to sell cultural property. So if you're a private individual, you want to sell something on eBay, something that you've inherited from your grandfather, you need to follow very strict due diligence rules. Otherwise, you're subject to, or you may be subject to, penal sanctions. The problem is, how do you find the right measure of due diligence? And this is where the ICOM red lists come in, because Germany said, if these are objects that come from conflict zones or areas of risk of archaeological sites being plundered, then you have to have a specific kind of due diligence, one that is specifically tough. And this is where the red lists come in, because as you know, the red lists of the International Council of Museums are practical tools that list types of objects, especially from countries and regions that are under particular threat of cultural heritage being illicitly trafficked or stolen. So the new German law in this part actually makes explicit reference to the ICOM red lists. And the fourth very important actually, pillar is that of penal sanctions, because unless there are penal sanctions that are, well, not so pleasant, it will be very hard to protect cultural heritage. And I think this is something that needs to be followed in other countries as well, as long as this is a cavalier's crime, as we say in Germany, as long as nothing happens to you, maybe except for a few €1,000 of penalty, why not risk it? And I think this is very important. There are countries of the world that have for a long time imposed very tough sanctions on, very tough penal sanctions on illicit trafficking or cultural heritage crimes. Maybe that is not the right avenue to take when you think about the death penalty, for example. But definitely, and this is actually the case, but definitely what's important is that you may actually know that you may end up in prison for 5 years if you do something against the National Cultural Heritage Law. There is a first case where the new law has been applied about 3 weeks ago, when 5 coin dealers were busted in Munich as at a coin fair, and this for the first time on the basis of the fact that they didn't have export licenses, export certificates. Until then, this would never have been a serious problem. But now it is a serious problem when you don't have export certificates from countries like Afghanistan, Iran, and India. And so it shows, one, the new law works. B, it also shows you need to monitor the market. And this sort of brings me to the second part of my talk, where I want to speak on what kind of research, what kind of monitoring is necessary to understand what's going on. Because obviously a good legal framework is important and is necessary. If you don't follow up on it, if you don't implement it, if you don't know really how the illicit trade in cultural objects is working, it's extremely hard, A, to make good laws, and B, to implement them effectively. This is the reason why the government has decided to finance a national research project against the backdrop of the UN Security Council resolutions that we've talked about before, a research project that would try to analyze the illicit trafficking in cultural objects in Germany and at the same time give customs and law enforcement an idea about the methods they need to use when they want to arrive at definite numbers. One of the biggest problems we have both on the national but also on the international level is that we don't have reliable numbers. Over the past 24 hours, I've done 3 radio interviews because of the G7 summit in Florence on illicit trafficking in cultural property. And the first question of the journalist is always, how much money do they make? And I don't know, because we cannot tell. We cannot tell for several reasons, but most importantly, we cannot tell because we don't monitor the market in a comprehensive fashion, and also because we don't really understand what's going on a national level. There are several isolated cases, and we'll hear about them later on, but to arrive at a systematic picture and also to have methods that are working that will give you a systematic picture, this is a completely different ball game, and this is the reason why Germany decided to do research financed by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. It started with a phone call from the National Criminal Police in 2013 when they asked me if I'd be willing to set something up, design something that could work, because they knew I had some experience. I was still working at Heidelberg University. They knew I had some experience in transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary projects, and they said, can you do something? Can you set up something that will give us criminological methods that work in the area of illicit trafficking in cultural objects? And what we've come up with is a transdisciplinary research design. Transdisciplinary research, you go outside of academia. You don't stay just within academia, but you use non-academic capacity and expertise as well, because obviously you need the expertise of customs and law enforcement and ministries in order to understand what's going on. This is a beautiful, beautiful example for a research question, for a societal challenge that can only be addressed when you use a transdisciplinary research design. The idea was to do an explorative study looking at the illicit traffic or the traffic in archaeological objects, mainly from Iraq and Syria, because this is my own expertise, but also because this is a very dynamic field, obviously. And we're doing this together with a number of associated partners, including, obviously, UNESCO, with whom we work very, very closely, ICOM, the Federal Foreign Office, and several other institutions. What do we do? The first important thing is identify and develop criminological methods. What we're doing is primarily a research on methods that will help national criminal police and other law enforcement institutions to get an idea about object types, turnovers, networks, and operation modes. We're trying to assess the potential for money laundering and terrorist financing. And what we'll do at the end is publish a best practice guide for all pertinent stakeholders, that is not just universities and law enforcement officials, but obviously also museums and everybody who gets or may get in touch with archaeological and cultural material. And we're also, I'll come back to that later if I have some minutes left, on digital tools to support this kind of research and work. We're actually doing 5 working packages or work packages that I will not go into detail here about. The partners are, and this is what's very important, partners from 3 different fields of academic research. Obviously, we do the analysis of the archaeological objects. Ancient studies is important, but then we're also working extremely closely with a Institute for Sociology, which does a national survey among all institutions and actors in this field. And we're also working with the Fraunhofer Institute for Secure Information Technology, because obviously a lot of what we're talking about is going on in the cyber realm. So we need to find ways to deal with this effectively. This is the list of our associate partners. This is not just name dropping. We need them all. We need them all. This is very important because if you decide to follow this example, which would be great, you need to know that apart from academia, you need many, many institutions that can contribute to this very complex and multifaceted field. Now, before I come to some of the numbers and observations, I wanted to remind you that for objects from Iraq and Syria, we have EU Council regulations, which means that if you are in the EU, objects from Iraq and Syria should not be in the market unless they've been there for, well, say, close to 10 years when we talk about Syria, and more than, well, almost 30 years when we talk about Iraq. The data we gather concerns object turnovers, authenticity, due diligence, routines, and so on. And I just wanted to give you some brief examples of what we're up against. The problem in the field is not the big names. The problem is that we have archaeological material from Iraq and Syria with auction houses and platforms that never used to deal in archaeological material from Iraq and Syria. This is, for example, an auction house, a German auction house that primarily specializes in folk art from the 19th and 20th century, but all of a sudden you have objects from Syria, purportedly or ostensibly from Syria. One may be a fake, the other one looks authentic. I'll go very, very quickly over the things we're doing in parts of our project. This is a national survey that is being done very, very professionally because surveys are one of the key instruments in criminological research. And we're doing this right now. It's ongoing with dealers, museums, law enforcement, experts, and conservators. And this is what it looks like. This had to be done, of course, in close collaboration with the experts. Because sociologists usually don't know what to ask for. So again, here it's important that law enforcement, ancient study people, archaeologists and sociologists work closely together. And then one last glimpse at probably the most exciting development in our project, which is what is being done by the technological experts, because there's so many objects in the market that human beings alone will not be able to monitor all of this. So we're developing tools that do both. They recognize certain keywords and they also recognize images. They store everything persistently so that law enforcement can go back to this data and use it. Very, very briefly, before I have to leave off, what are the lessons that we've learned and what is important over the years to come? One is, and Maria Mignana mentioned it earlier, one is that the kind of research that we're doing cannot be done in Germany alone. There are two lessons basically. One is research has to be international, and going back to the German law, the other lesson is if Germany alone is doing it, what good does it do for the European Union? So obviously we need something similar, something corresponding on the European level for the European single market. The same obviously applies to research. We need to transfer the methods, the research design onto the international level, and this is why we're so happy that together with the section of movable heritage and museums of UNESCO, and in particular together with Maria Mignana, we've been able to develop this concept for a pro-cult UNITWIN UNESCO network that will bring together excellent research universities both in the north and the south to promote and to support this kind of research, and also to prepare the ground for a strong and sustainable bond between the academic world, civil society, local communities, research, and policymaking, because this is what it takes. As long as it's an isolated approach by academics, by politicians, or NGOs, it will not work. It has to be a movement that encompasses all the capacities and all the institutions that can contribute to this effort. And this is also why awareness raising is so extremely important, because a lot of things are done out of ignorance, out of lack of awareness. Collectors are not bad people per se. Collectors sometimes think they protect cultural heritage when they buy cultural heritage in the market. I hear that very, very frequently as an argument. But of course they're wrong, because for what they're buying in the market, other things have been destroyed and people have been exploited. So I think we need a very, very strong global awareness-raising campaign, more campaigns like Unite for Heritage, because we all know changing awareness takes a lot of time. We've seen it with certain illnesses, we've seen it with the protection of endangered wildlife. The second thing we've learned, and this is my last slide and my last suggestion, is that in order to make protection against illicit trafficking effective on a national level, you need to tackle the challenge of providing academic expertise to law enforcement and to customs. And this is why we've proposed, and it's under review for financing by the German government, a moderated expert network that will actually be able to provide the certified expertise to law enforcement and government. This is why we need to do something on a national and international level to provide the necessary academic expertise, because what it comes down to in the end, police can only react when they know if the objects are authentic and where they come from. And this information has to go to the police very, very quickly, and it has to go there confidentially and reliably. But how do you do that with 7 regions of the world? Within each region you have 50 or 60 different societies with different kinds of archaeological or cultural material. So this is, to me, this is the biggest challenge, getting the academic expertise into the non-academic room and make it available to the people who actually make the decision and can act. So in a lot of ways, the requirements, the financial and infrastructural requirements, are very small. What it takes primarily is political will to be more professional on this level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your experiences from Germany with us. So, questions from the floor?
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Staffan Lundén from Gothenburg University. I'm an archaeologist working there. And thank you very, very much for a very interesting presentation, and with, I think, a very good focus on what one can actually do. And I'm very glad to hear that Germany is actually now having an import law. So in contrast to most countries which only have an export law and no corresponding import law. And that, of course, also includes Sweden, which is a country which protects its own archaeological artifacts, etc. You cannot export them, but it doesn't have a corresponding import law. And you mentioned international cooperation, etc. So this is, well, a question for you. And if there is anyone in the audience as well from, let's say, the Ministry of Culture, they could also take up this question. But do you think it would be a good idea if also Sweden followed Germany's lead here and actually get some decent legislation in this field and actually has import laws?
Well, this is tricky. Obviously, I'm not in a position to give advice to Sweden. What I would like to say is that if you're serious about the protection of cultural heritage of other countries, if you're serious about efficiently implementing the 1970 Convention, I cannot see how you would get around strong import regulations.
Hello, my name is Knut Abel. I'm from the National Heritage Board, formerly a Minister of Culture. And to Staffan Lundén, I might say that we have ratified the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention, which effectively means that we support, we have an import regulation. If objects are exported from another country without the permission, they should be returned. However, this affects only the countries who have ratified the UNIDROIT Convention. So, of course, there is a gap there somehow. But I would like to pose a question to you, Mr. Hilgert. You have a very extensive legislation, obviously, concerning cultural objects. Why haven't you ratified the UNIDROIT Convention? Because, in effect, it has the same meaning. So, why don't you do it? You're not the German government, obviously.
I'm not,
but
unfortunately, I'm not the head of the German government. I think two reasons for this. One reason is that for a very long time, like Maria Mignana pointed out earlier, the German government was of the opinion that ratifying the UNIDROIT Convention would do too much harm to the art market. Germany has undergone an immense change of awareness over the last 10 to 15 years. And this also has to do, of course, with the political parties that form the government. This is very clear to see. Now, I think Germany believes that with the new cultural heritage protection law that actually uses a lot of the principles of the UNIDROIT Convention, it is not necessary anymore to formally ratify it. Because also going back, I skipped this because of time constraints, going back to the EU Directive 2014-60, that actually uses a lot of principles and a lot of stipulations of the UNIDROIT Convention. So unfortunately for UNIDROIT, a lot of national legislations, but also regulations on the EU level, use the standards set by UNIDROIT.
We have time for more questions.
If the European Union does do something, might it be kind enough to include the UK anyway?
Now I even have to answer your question. I think the UK will have to find their own solution, obviously. But that said, it's also clear that the UK is doing a lot to protect cultural heritage. There is, as you know better than I do, a cultural heritage protection fund that comprises £30 million that is used for training academics, for capacity building initiatives. At the same time, of course, if you don't belong to the single market anymore and you're serious about this, again, I'm repeating myself, yes, you need stronger import controls. Also because it damages you internationally if you don't have them. We usually talk about these things in closed circles. UNESCO doesn't, because UNESCO is always operating on the international level. When you talk about this in Germany, you usually exclude the perspective of the countries like Iraq and Syria, also Greece, many other countries who do not understand why countries like Germany, UK, Switzerland, who are known and proven to be strong market countries, do not more to prevent the illicit trafficking in cultural objects. So I think for the international reputation of Germany, it has been of great advantage to have this law, even though within Germany there was a lot of hostility against the minister and also against the people who worked for this law. But internationally, this has been the right step because it does damage international relations and relations between countries.
Just very briefly concerning UNIDROIT, in fact, as Markus was saying, many countries in Europe, for instance the Netherlands, have not ratified UNIDROIT, but in any case, the new legislation, they already include most of these positions of the convention. So this is the case in many art market countries now, that instead of ratifying, they just include the dispositions of UNIDROIT in the national law. So, as he was saying, I don't think that the ratification rate of UNIDROIT is going to increase dramatically in forthcoming years, but at least it's going to be somehow applied. And also, Sam, something positive news. At least the UK will be one of the beneficiary countries of the art market project because it's in the short term, so at least that's that.
One more question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this inspiring presentation. My question is, how is the reaction of the other side, for example, the Syrian or the Iraqi governments or Antiquities authorities regarding these updating?
Extremely positive, as I just said, because until then it was very hard to communicate why Germany, with all its high ethical standards, would not be more efficient in this area. And in fact, when the minister presented the law at the end of September in Berlin, she did that in front of 50 ambassadors of state parties to the 1970 convention, and it was an extremely successful event because for the first time they felt understood. Because, I mean, you can imagine how frustrating it is for the representative of a country like Egypt or any other country who knows there are archaeological objects in the German art market that have been stolen, and it's proven they have been stolen from a museum or archaeological site, when you cannot get them back because the German law does not have a provision for returning these objects. As I said before, whatever returns or restitutions took place in Germany did not take place on the basis of the law, but because there were deals worked out between the respected parties. And I think really for the international stance of Germany, also for cultural institutions in Germany, and I'm benefiting from that myself, it's been extremely helpful to have this new law because it demonstrates a changed awareness and also a heightened responsibilities of markets that or countries that are art markets, because as long as there is a demand, as you said earlier, as long as there is a strong demand, it'll be attractive for people to pillage and loot archaeological sites. So we have to do something about the demand for illegally exported archaeological material.
Thank you very much. So, thank you.